All right, rapid fire. So we're gonna get right into this. Hey, do you guys wanna exist over here? That'd be great. So, as we think about like client relationships, to start, it's this concept of, okay, say you sign a new client, what do we do? How do we get started? Where do we spend the budget? How do we set goals? And that's essentially what this presentation is gonna cover today. So the stage is here. If we talk about how we actually think about developing strategy for clients, it starts with establishing your goals. That seems pretty simple. Probably don't need to spend a lot of time on that. But then identifying bottom funnel. I threw a lot of shade at the bottom of the funnel earlier today, but it's still very important. It's just everything that goes beyond that. Optimizing the bottom of the funnel, looking for things like long tail keywords, making sure that your ad copy is clean and intact and aligned with all the best practices. That kind of fits in line with what Ronnie was talking about with the playbook. It's doing all those things correctly at the bottom of the funnel so you could build a scalable engine on top of that. The next part of that, after you identify where your bottom of the funnel exists, is setting your budgets there. And then once you get all that together, looking upper funnel. And that's what Brandon from Stack It Up is going to help us kind of identify, and they work a lot with us to develop upper funnel strategy. They're very great at it. And then finally, measuring the halo effect, the exposure piece, and how all this works together. So talking about bottom funnel, Mr. Brendan Roach.
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Excited to be here. This is the first time I think we've had external guests for DOLAH, which is incredibly exciting. So really to get into this presentation, starting from the root up. When we inherit an account, when we come on board, what we really try to think about is where is the lowest hanging fruit? Where can we get users to convert most frequently at the most profitable rate? That typically starts at the bottom of the funnel. So let's go through a little bit of an example here. So the way this develops out really is thinking about the brand and then digging deeper into where the buyer intent actually lies. So you might look at a company and you might be selling picture frames, art frames, etc. And when you start to dig into this, the way you would go about looking at this would start at something like home decor. Now that is a broad range of things, and we'll get into that. But then you want to dig in deeper and keep drilling down until you get to a point where the user is almost, I would say, more likely than 2.25%, because that is what average conversion rate for e-commerce is. So more likely than that percentage. So right, you dig down and you go into frames, and then you go from there and you dig into custom canvas picture frame. So then to go off of that, this is the example. When you look at home decor, it could mean a broad amount of things. It could mean anything from a vase for your coffee table. It could mean something like a picture stand. It could mean a bookshelf. It could mean wallpaper. It could mean a broad range of things. But as you start to drill down, you really get into the point of conversion, right? So custom canvas picture frames is so much more exact than what you started at, which is home decor. So as you drill down, really the biggest thing that starts to develop is that you have a higher and higher likelihood of conversion. So your conversion rate continually increases as you get lower and lower in the funnel, and typically the exchange there is that you have less and less volume behind those searches. So when you start to think about this, and we'll get into this, and Patrick really alluded to this earlier, is when you start to do this, you're telling Google and you're telling these search engines that you are willing to participate in less auctions, and therefore, typically, you start to get charged more from a CPC perspective. And that's really what Patrick was getting into earlier, where very, very bottom of funnel searches are much more expensive traditionally than upper funnel searches. But the trade-off there is that conversion rates sit higher, and you really have to start to evaluate, is that good for your business? Are you going to be successful in bottom of funnel, which is what we'll get into in a little bit. As we get into that, the only other thing to add here is that when you look at these bottom of funnel searches, there's things externally that do affect predictability and conversion rate. So, for example, I think the best thing that we could probably align with is a search that takes place and a user doesn't really have a deep understanding for like the model number or something along those lines, where there's different intent signals that tell the user that they're at the bottom of the funnel. And this really goes into that automation piece in the age of automation, where different intent signals signify that that user is the most likely to convert. But yeah, transitioning over, what we'll start to talk about is how you determine really allocation of budget to bottom of funnel and how successful you would be in bottom of funnel. So for that, I'm going to transition over to Patrick again.
Yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah, the concept of bottom of funnel, it's mostly talked about in terms of search query. But that last slide, looked like a Rubik's Cube, is really to show that search query is just one of the many tools that we have to identify high intent. It's really a proxy. And we found success with a lot of other channels that also prove to be bottom of the funnel. Specifically, in a lot of cases, Waze and Yelp. We actually have Matt from Yelp here. Matt, round of applause for Matt. Yelp low-key has an incredible advertising platform that is bottom funnel in a lot of different aspects. But now as we bridge the gap, so now we know what we're talking about when we say bottom of the funnel. It's a type of ad campaign or a type of tactic that has a very high likelihood of getting in front of somebody who's actively in the market for the product or service that you're selling. So we figured that out. Now the first step here is to figure out what are our goals. So client comes on board and we ask them, what are your goals? And a lot of times, the answer to that is something as simple as, well, our goal is that we want to get at least a 3 times return on ad spend, which for anyone that is new to the return on ad spend metric, it's essentially profit that's derived from your advertising investment. This is the staple. This is how people talk about goals in this industry. And I don't like it. I don't think it's helpful, because a 3 times return on ad spend is a percentage, like, okay, well, if we spent $100 or if we spent $100,000, the actual profit that you'll derive from that is very, very different. So what I really like to do is take a step back to figure out, okay, well, what is the actual business? What are the goals of the business? So the real goal of that same company might be to maximize profit given a 65% cost of goods sold. Okay, so now we're getting here, because that's essentially a different way to talk about return on ad spend, but it actually is more helpful, because now we're talking about profit margins, which might be different depending on what products you're selling, and all this stuff can help your ad agency develop strategy and profit goals that are a little bit more helpful. But I wouldn't stop here, because again, it doesn't really show how much we want to spend or what sort of other variables there are. So there's generally a second piece of this, which is, okay, well, our goal is to maximize profit, but we also want to retain, like, let's say a minimum of 300K in revenue next month. So whatever that is, let's use that as our guiding light. And this is something that I really think is helpful when having discussions around strategy. Now, when you take this, we can work backwards to figure out a more helpful budget and return on ad spend goal. I'm not going to go into this. No one wants to see equations, but if you don't know how to calculate profit, you can take a photo of this or you can Google it. But then just kind of figuring out, okay, well, that's how you calculate profit. How do we solve for break even? And if you just kind of plug in the numbers that we were given, so it's like, okay, well, we want to get at least 300K in revenue. We have a 65% cost of goods sold. We don't know what our cost is yet, but if we wanted to break even with 0 profit, we just kind of walk down the line here, we end up figuring out that we need to spend about $105,000 if we wanted to get exactly $300,000 in revenue, and that would be break even. Again, don't dwell on this, take a photo of it if you've never kind of gone through this exercise before. And essentially what this gives us is our return on ad spend goal. So our break even return on ad spend here, given those 2 benchmarks, is actually 2.86. So the client may have come to us and said, hey, listen, we want to get a 3 times return on ad spend. And that's not a complete goal, because they probably did this same calculation on their end, and they're just giving you like we're going to build in some profit here. But this is actually more helpful because now the agency can look at this and say, okay, well, what if we spent $200K and got a 10 times return on ad spend? Or what if we spent $500K and got a 2.9% return on ad spend? We might actually be able to maximize profit in like a multitude of different ways. And what I think is really helpful in terms of developing strategy is looking at a lot of different scenarios. Because the reality of it is, once you kickstart your ad campaigns, things are never gonna go the way that you expect them to. So you might find like, oh, like we really expected to be able to hit a 5 times return on ad spend with our Performance Max campaigns. And you might find out that after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever, it's just not the case. So you can adjust your model and you could say, okay, well, actually we're gonna shoot for a lower budget here, adjust this, and now we can, at the end of the day, maximize profit. So this is just my recommendation as far as looking at setting goals, setting budgets. It's a more helpful conversation to have between agency and client. Now we've established this, I'm gonna hand it to Nechama, who's gonna talk through all the different decisions that we make as far as where we should be spending budget and why. Nechama, our VP of Strategy, let's give her a round of applause.
So once we have our goals and our budget, the next thing is where are we actually gonna advertise? And that's what we're trying to figure out here. So the first question we would ask is, where does our audience live? You're in different industries, the answer may be different. Within certain industries, the answer might be different depending on your product line. But if you think broadly, something that's more B2B focused might be more LinkedIn, something that's more e-commerce focused might be more on Google, and so on. Once we've decided where our audience exists, now we want to see if that channel allows us to convey our core message. There's different ways that we can convey messages, and for one product, it might be very visual. For example, Google Search is typically not a visual platform, with the exception of the image extensions, but that if your main selling point is something that's visual, that might not be a platform where you are able to convey that in the best way. Other platforms are very price sensitive. Different platforms have different ways of being able to communicate messages, and we're asking if the channel allows you to convey your core message. If the channel does not, then that's going to be categorized as a top of funnel channel, essentially a user acquisition channel. So it's the right audience, but we can't talk to them in the way that we want to at this point. In the event that the channel allows us to convey the core message, the next question that we'll ask is, will the channel allow us to drive conversions in the short term? If not, then that would be a middle funnel channel. So it's a channel that might take a little bit longer. Pinterest would be an example of, depending on your goals, but that's a channel that typically can be a middle funnel channel. It's a planning channel where the audience lives. We can communicate, but it typically takes a little bit more time than some other channels to get people to actually convert. And in the event that the channel allows us to drive conversions in the short term, that is categorized as a bottom funnel channel. So now that we have our bottom funnel channels and we know what they are, there's still differences between different channels. And when we say channels, it could be like an actual channel, it could be different campaigns. It's really just any segmentation of a marketing tactic. So now we're going to be more focused on profitability. Within profitability, there's 2 main metrics. I would say there's also a third one, which is the AOV, but that's going to be e-commerce specific. So to keep it more generalized, it's going to be your CPCs and your conversion rate. If conversion rate is higher and CPCs are lower, that's typically how you end up being very profitable. Different tactics within bottom of the funnel can have different projected conversion rates as well as different CPCs. So what we're going to ask here is, do the CPCs and expected conversion rate of the channel suggest profitability? If not, then we're going to deprioritize that channel until we have proper upper funnel campaign set up, which will impact our projected conversion rate. And then this might be an expensive channel to advertise on, but if our projected conversion rate goes up, then it can become profitable. If the CPCs at expected conversion rate predict profitability, then we're going to ask, are there multiple priority bottom of funnel channels? If not, we could determine the max budget that we want to invest in that channel and essentially put the rest of our budget into upper funnel channels. If there are multiple priority bottom funnel channels, then we're gonna ask, does anyone suggest higher ROAS, right? Because even within the framework of profitability, there's going to be different levels. If so, then we wanna determine basically maximize those channels where you're gonna have the highest ROAS, but in the event that they're all similar, or you get to the point where the ones that are left are all similar, then we're gonna ask, does one channel provide more reach or lower CPM? So we might get the same ROAS, but if we get more reach, that's back to what Patrick was talking about earlier about the halo effect and having a longer term impact where you can use these channels for more than one objective. And so does the channel provide more reach and a lower CPMs? If so, then we're gonna prioritize this channel, but not with more than 60% of the budget. In the event that they're similar, then we will distribute the budget evenly across, or essentially just use your best judgment. And I believe we're back to you, Patrick.
We love a good decision tree. Thanks, Nahama. That was great. The graphic is a little confusing, but really what a decision tree does, it essentially allows you to just ask questions throughout the process. I remember a day where we just used to look at a client and say like, all right, we're just gonna spend as much as possible on Google and then we'll see what happens next. And that's not a very sophisticated way to develop a strategy. I think the point that you made about this is more visual, I think that's a great point that, you get a client, it's we work with clients that sell, odd looking things that kind of fit into a category, but it's more of a visual thing that there's not a lot of Google search for it. So historically it was okay, well that would fit into Facebook, right? I think this is a more intelligent way to think about that. So it's really just asking yourself these questions as you go through, and we're gonna publish a blog post with this graphic on it so you guys don't have to worry about squinting. I'm gonna go back here again, because I didn't talk about it enough, but it's really, again, talking about the exposure, because this is where we bridge the gap between bottom funnel and what happens after that, and why it's all simultaneous. I'm giving an example here of a search for insulated water bottle. And if you can't see, so this is a Google search, and the main search ads at the top, we have a brand called Swell, which I'm not familiar with. The second one is swag.com. The third one is Yeti, which I am familiar with. I'm sure a lot of people here are. And the fourth one is Hydro Flask. What's interesting here is Yeti clearly has the advantage. Yeti is kind of a household name at this point. You've seen their coolers, you've seen their coffee mugs, you've seen their insulated water bottles. I carry mine with me everywhere I go. They've built a brand, right? They clearly have an advantage just being on this non-branded search. As much as you want to say that Google is a level playing field, it's absolutely not. And it proves it, because if you look, Swell at the top, they have the number one, they're bidding to number one. You would think that that's great. And their ad copy is best practice. If you were to ever read an article about how you should write Google text ads, it's got keywords in there. It's insulated hot, cold water bottles, 15% off your order. They're talking about a promotion that's coming out. They have the site link extensions. They're doing everything right. You scroll down to Yeti, they don't care about any of that stuff. They probably do. But they're starting their headline with the word Yeti, because they know that the brand that they built matters, that it carries, that if someone's doing a search for this, that the fact that they're jumping off the screen saying, hey everyone, we're Yeti, by the way, we sell water bottles, that's a huge advantage. So I would bet that based on this, even though they're third position on the page, that Yeti will have a much more significantly higher click-through rate compared to any of these other competitors, regardless of position or what your ad copy says, because they had built the brand. But let's think about what that practically means, going back to that other conversation about profit margins and cost of goods sold. Now, let's assume for a second that the Yeti brand, their exposure that they've built, is worth 20%. Meaning, compared to Swell, a brand that I've never heard of, it's worth 20% more in click-through rate and 20% more in conversion rate. Because realistically, your average person is more likely to convert on a page, on a website, for a brand they're familiar with compared to a brand they've never heard of. So let's say it's just worth 20%. holding every other variable equal, meaning the cost per click is the same, their cost of goods sold is the same, their average order is the same, Yeti has more than twice the amount of profit, 2.5 times the amount of profit that Swell is earning in this ecosystem. Okay, and that's a very conservative estimate. Now, let's assume that it's worth a little bit more. Let's assume that that Yeti ad, that search ad, is worth twice as much, meaning your average person is twice as likely to click on that ad for Yeti than they would be for Swell. You run those same numbers, and now the net profit that Yeti is earning compared to their competitor Swell is more than 3 times the amount. Crazy stuff. Now, you might be saying, okay, well, like, that's fine. We're okay with the fact that we have a bit of a smaller margin. Actually, before we even get there, sorry, I forgot what the next slide was. Let's actually be realistic about this for a second, because this is certainly worth more, but Yeti is a bigger company. They've been around for a while. They probably have a better supply chain, which means that they probably have better margins in their cost of goods sold. And they're probably better at cross-selling and increasing average order value. Right, so like your average person selling a water bottle, it might be $85, but realistically, Yeti might be pretty good at getting an average order value of $100 with a cost of goods sold of 60% compared to 75. That's just what happens. Bigger businesses that are established have better margins and get more money out of the average consumer. So what happens here is more than 8 times the net profit. Again, holding cost per click equal, holding all these other things constant. This is not a level playing field. The brand that was established is earning more than 8 times the amount of profit than their competitor. But like I was gonna say before I got off track, let's say that Swell is like, okay, that's fine, like we don't care. Like we're on Google search, we're happy with our $5,000 a month budget, we're making some profit, this is great, we have a nice little business running. But that's not what happens, because the reality of how this plays out in an economic environment is Yeti's not just gonna sit there, they're gonna optimize their campaigns. They're gonna say, okay, well, we're earning a ton of profit here, so let's increase our bids and capture more market share. And what happens when Yeti increases their bids? It raises the market price of the auction, which in turn increases the cost per click for Swell, and now Swell is no longer profitable. This is what happens when brand like Swell, I'm not saying they're doing this, this is just an example, but this is what happens when a smaller brand attempts to exclusively fight over bottom funnel traffic. And then they wake up one day and say, my campaigns aren't profitable, Google must be doing something wrong. No, it's because the other brand has never taken a moment to figure out, oh, there is value in exposure and brand awareness, because this is not a level playing field. These marginal gains in click-through rate and conversion rate that take place at every version of the funnel is what makes the difference. And if you do not take that seriously, your campaigns will be unprofitable and you will fail in this modern ecosystem. Now, to talk about how we do that, because it is possible. You don't have to be Yeti to be able to build a brand, to be able to drive brand equity, to find your audience, to be able to get your message across. So to be able to talk about how businesses of all size, small, big, enterprise, whatever, we have Brandon from StackAdapt. Take it away.
Awesome. Well, hello and Adventure. Thanks for having us here. It's been a great day so far and looking forward to see everything that comes down after this conversation. For a little bit of context, I've been at StackAdapt for about 6 years, and when I started roughly 6 years ago in a tiny office in Toronto, we were about 25 people. And we were a digital marketing company with lofty goals, but very, very small. If we were to fast forward to where we are today and looking ahead into 2023, we're about to eclipse the 1,000 employee mark. We've launched offices all across North America, Europe, APAC region, Australia, and Latin America is about to hit the ground running. And we have done all of that with the same basic principles that Patrick was talking about a little bit earlier around Maslow. And instead of looking at what StackAdapt does, which is programmatic advertising, as a hammer, we prefer to look at ourselves as more of that toolbox with a number of individual tools within them. And if we were to think about building something, Very infrequently, you're using one tool, but instead using many. Some of them will be within one toolbox. Sometimes you'll have to open a second one. And we take that same approach when we're working in the programmatic space to help complement and grow lower funnel channels that Patrick, Nahama, and Avery, and Brendan just spoke about. First thing I want to cover is the paid media landscape. And what we're looking at today is very different than last year and incredibly different than 2015 or 2016 or even 2017. And the best way to contextualize this is by thinking about a basic supply and demand graph. I was not a very good economics student, but I could grasp the idea of supply and demand. And usually when one goes up or down, the other has an inverse reaction. If we think about real estate, if there's more supply of houses, demand will go down. If there's more demand for houses, supply will go down. But in the advertising space, we're actually in a very interesting spot now where we have both supply and demand increasing at the same time and adding more and more supply and demand lines within the advertising ecosystem as a whole. And if we think about supply, we're thinking about publishers within the traditional sense, like Yelp, but also things like connected television or digital out of home or programmatic audio, where we can now expose users and capture users in a much broader sense of how we label the internet versus the way we thought about it 5 years ago or 6 years ago. In that same vein, there's also a lot more people consuming digital content. There's about 150 people in this room, maybe, a bit more, a bit less. Everybody here consumes digital content, but we all do it a little bit differently. The average individual is consuming digital content on anywhere between 5 to 10 mediums. Because it's almost 2023, we can now capture people in every single one of them. And when we're thinking about programmatic advertising as a way to advertise on the internet, the way we define the internet now is not just online or on your phone, but really any digital screen that's connected to the internet, from a full takeover of Times Square to an ad within a video game you're playing on your phone or on an Xbox or PlayStation. As a result of that, consumers of digital media are getting much smarter. However, so are we. And by we, I mean everybody in here is advertisers, brands, agencies, and other technology platforms. With all of that in mind, we have to ask ourselves how we can leverage these broader toolkits to bring down your overall marketing CPAs and increase profitability across the board. And the first question we always like to ask is who we're targeting. When we think about an audience, doesn't matter what product or service we're advertising for, the audience itself is going to be finite in number. As a result of that, to Patrick's earlier comments, we'll see more established brands that have a higher investment level across the board continue to crush smaller brands that don't have the affordability of building a brand awareness because bottom funnel campaigns are getting more competitive. And when we think about kind of lower funnel campaigns and the competitiveness and nature of CPA advertising as a whole, especially within search, we're seeing more and more frequently that only investing in the bottom of the funnel is going to yield negative profitability for a brand overall and poses a really big question, which is how do we convince an audience who doesn't know about our brand to click on our ad and make a purchase on our website that we otherwise would not have captured earlier? And really draw a line in the sand on where does that law of diminishing returns start to occur within the search ecosystem? And how do we supplement that with other various means of programmatic advertising and media as a whole to build this idea of brand awareness and engagement and kind of draw that circle of exposure and almost create a halo effect where people have a more positive association with your brand at the top and middle of the funnel in a very messy drawn line, so that when they see your ad at the bottom of the funnel, they're a lot more likely to click on it. And to build on that a little bit, I want to talk about different ad formats that we would think of, some of them traditionally in the digital space, and some of them that have really emerged over the past several years. CTV and digital out of home could be big call-outs. In-game advertising is another area that I personally find very cool as a gamer myself. But it's always important to consider, number one, where your audience is going to live, and number two, the cost effectiveness of reaching them there versus something that's more cost effective. And the easiest way to look at that would be comparing two mediums like connected television and online video. Both of them, as entities, are more or less the same. In many cases, you'll see brands even using the same asset in a 30-second video spot versus a 30-second connected television spot. And before I go any further, to keep everybody engaged here, if we were to think of connected TV versus online video as two separate entities, what would be the biggest difference? And not all at once. Nobody? What's that? Skippable is huge. That's one of them. Not what I was looking for. Cost. Online video is traditionally way less expensive than connected television. The CPMs in the CTV environment can range anywhere between $20 to $100 depending on where you're advertising, time of year. If you wanted to buy a connected television ad during March Madness or the Super Bowl, although Super Bowl is mostly upfronts, that's going to be really expensive. And what we try to encourage all of our partners to do is try to draw the line of where does the combination of exposure and cost yield profitability at a lower funnel? And really, as we develop that conversation, I'm not the best at math, but I'm going to say let's do a math question anyways. Because what we're looking to do is measure the incremental performance of exposing somebody in a channel or a medium that will yield larger attention than traditional online digital advertising and is sacrificing greater cost for connected television going to yield an incremental lift in overall exposure that will ultimately drive a much lower cost per acquisition if you look at your marketing spend as a whole. And how do we define that? Any takers? We're looking for the intersection of cost, exposure, and frequency. For us, we like to think of it as looking at a channel less in terms of how much it's going to cost you, and instead work backwards from conversion rates. And if we know that running a campaign in the connected television environment, or in a digital out-of-home environment, or even in programmatic audio when we're listening to music or a podcast on the way to DOLAH, what is that incremental lift in brand exposure going to impact your lower funnel campaigns? And is it worth spending extra money in that capacity versus only going to a more cost-effective channel like online video that historically, based on a ton of research, is probably going to be less efficient at building brand exposure, awareness, and resonance? And if we take that overarching narrative as a whole, and we take a step back and look at how to make search campaigns more effective, kind of brings us back to this idea of a halo effect, where to Patrick's comments about Swell versus Yeti, although I myself am aware of Swell, although my fiance only buys Yeti products and it's getting excessive. If we're more likely to click on a Yeti campaign or a Yeti search ad, it's probably because we know who they are. And the reason why we know who they are is because Yeti has done a really good job at positioning their brand in a positive environment all across the internet. And I'm not talking about the internet as on your phone or laptop or mobile device. I'm talking about the definition of the internet as really any screen that's connected to the internet whatsoever. With all that being said, considering the massive impact that all of this new technology can have on a brand's performance, combined with all this rich data that's available to us, investing in growing upper funnel and mid funnel channel and exposure has never been more profitable. And as a result of that, a reason why we're seeing big brands like Yeti start to see more fierce competition from smaller brands that are starting to explore how to build a brand awareness campaign or get their message out there without having to shell out millions upon millions of dollars and just write it off as an expense. And instead, move that on a balance sheet to a cost of goods sold with the expectation that we're gonna bring down the overall marketing cost per acquisition and increase profitability. And that's it for me.